Hi, and welcome to the second of two lecture narrations having to do with social influence. I wanted to spend a little more time, a couple more minutes, talking about obedience. Remember that how I finished the last narration was to indicate that this conditioned, socialized a tendency to obey authority, okay, that's our impulse to obey authority, and we do, okay, usually is very functional, serves us well, okay. Usually authority figures know more than we do, okay, typically that's the case. They may, and in fact, obeying authority helps to maintain a certain amount of social order. Okay, the problem is when the obedience habit, if you will, gets overextended, overgeneralized, overused. As and an extreme example of that is, of course, uh, the Milgram obedience studies. But in the real world, we saw. Uh, we saw what happened in Nazi Germany, where the people who committed all kinds um, of of atrocities. In many cases, their reason was, well, they were just following orders. Okay, we see this in other kind of grievous examples of in war and in prisons and in other kinds of settings like that. We also see it, though, in more normal and less um, malignant aspects of society. So, for example, the relationship between doctors and nurses. Traditionally, nurses have been trained to um, basically blindly obey what doctors say. Okay, the doctor knows best. You need not question the doctor's orders or instructions. That leads to sometimes rather one silly, not silly, but one interesting anecdotal example is the case in which um, a nurse was given a written instruction to go to this patient who was in the hospital for a serious infection, basically in the upper respiratory and head regions. And the instruction was to basically, it was written out, was to give these drops. Okay, and so she proceeded to. Don't want to be sexist about that, but it was a female nurse in this case. But of course, there are male nurses, and that just happened to be the case. Um, no gender bias implied. But in this particular case, the nurse was a female, and yeah, it just happened to be. She went and actually it turned out that the doctor was a female too. So, um, but that's neither here nor there. Uh, the nurse goes in and administers 4 drops of this medication into the anus, um, into the butt of the patient. Okay. Now the patient had issues um, that had nothing to do, apparently, with um, you know the lower extremities or the buttocks or the anus or you know the colon or anything like that. Why did she do that? Well, as it turns out, the instructions basically were written in typical doctor, difficult to read script, and it said 4 drops in R period EAR, but the period was very subtle. Okay, and she took it to mean 4 drops in the rear. Okay, but what it was supposed to be was right ear. That's funny, but that's kind of like following the order you think you have without questioning. Okay, and this has been a serious problem, and medical and nursing schools have tried to address it in recent years by talking about the need to, in some cases, question and to not blindly follow. Okay, and a more serious example was a study that was actually done in which um, um, doctors where who participated called the nursing state or the nursing stations of had hospital wards and basically instructed people to go and the staff, mainly nurses and related kinds of staffs, to go and to give a shot, a medication to a certain patient that would ultimately probably kill the person. Okay. And a majority of people who answered the phone at the nursing station actually obeyed the doctor's orders and went to the room and began to prepare this medication to give them. Fortunately, of course, this was an experiment and they were intercepted before they got around to actually killing the person. But the blind obedience was a problem here. Okay, so um, these are the downside examples of over applying what is usually a constructive and good heuristic to have. This is something that's been addressed and is increasingly addressed in medical and nursing schools as just another example. But just to give you an idea of what I mean when I say that we are kind of conditioned to and socialized to obey authority, but what we need to learn to use is judgment in terms of when maybe you need to get beyond that, you need to get outside of that habit and question it. Because obedience is a strong kind of orientation that we as human beings tend to have, or at least we're socialized to have. Okay, enough of that. Let's push on with some other forms of social influence. Okay, we'll talk about group behavior. Okay. So we talk about some of these phenomena. We'll talk about them all of them briefly in turn, and they're all discussed to some extent and in some summary fashion in the textbook. Okay. So let's start with social facilitation. When others arouse us. Okay. How does the mere presence of others affect our behavior? Well, there were early studies done more than 100 years ago by an early an early experimental social psychologist by the name of Triplett, okay, who basically studied simple behaviors like bicycling. We'll talk about those and fishing reel too, but he discovered in very controlled studies that bicyclists, okay, bicycled faster, okay, when they were either compared to bicycling alone and racing against the clock. Okay, as fast as you can, we're racing against the clock, versus racing in a race, okay, with other bicyclists, okay, co-actors, okay, versus bicycling against the clock, but in this case, an audience is watching you, okay. In both the co-action and the co-bicyclist co-action condition and in the audience condition, they bicycled faster, okay, than they did when they were simply racing the clock. So the presence of others, either as co-actors or as an audience, increased their their speed, increased facilitated performance. That's where the term comes from. In another study, children had faster winding times when they were working side by side than when working alone. Okay. Cyclists raced faster against others than against the clock, okay, as I've already said. Later research, however, found conflicting findings. Sometimes the presence of others enhanced performance, as it did in Triplett studies. Other times, performance declined. What was going on? Okay, sometimes the presence of others actually interfered with performance and rather than facilitate it, it debilitated it. Okay. Well, the solution to the problem, okay, came from a well-known social psychologist, a late social psychologist by the name of Bob Zients. Rhymes with science. Um, so Zients resolved the problem um, by pointing out that what happens when um, we'll just stick with another person before we get to the species. When another person or a member of the same species is present, okay, that naturally increases our arousal. Okay, so another person is present, we get more physiologically aroused. What arousal does is it strengthens whatever the stronger, the more dominant kind of automatic response is going to be, okay, that you have, okay. So if it's an easy task, okay, or something that you really learn to do really well so that it's become easy, then that arousal is going to help, okay. Um, that arousal is going to help, going to make the correct response more likely, it's going to enhance performance. But if it's a really hard task that you haven't learned well, something that you're a novice at, okay, that you're new at, okay, that makes it more likely, the presence of others, that you're going to have an incorrect response because the dominant response isn't going to be the right one. Okay, it's going to be whatever whatever response is dominant in the situation where you haven't really learned to do this really really well. So there's going to be a lot of interference. So on difficult or new tasks, okay. The presence of others leads to a negative social facilitation effect that impairs performance. But if it's an easy task or something we're already really good at, so that our dominant response is the correct one, we're going to, our performance is going to be enhanced. Actually, part of Zions's research program to study this involved subhuman creatures that were really subhuman, cockroaches. Okay, so he did a study where cockroaches, okay, either had to perform the task of running straight ahead, okay, or they had to turn some corners into a little maze. Now, the stimulus, okay, was light. Anybody who's ever had a cockroach on their kitchen floor or something like that, or seen a cockroach, knows that they scurry away when in the light. Okay, so he did say where they're in this kind of like either a runway or a little maze. Okay, and it can be completely dark, and then the light would shine. Okay, and then you can measure how fast the cockroach ran away or made it through the maze away from the light. Okay, so when they do it alone, okay, you can measure how fast is it happening when they're alone. Okay, but then he also had a situation where there actually were other cockroaches, kind of like an audience of cockroaches, visible to the cockroach. Okay, and so what Zients was able to demonstrate in this interesting study was that if it was running straight ahead, which is a dominant response, just scurry away, okay, the presence of other cockroaches when the light went on made them go faster, okay, but if it was a more complicated way of getting out of the light, okay, such as a little maze, you had to make some turns, they went slower. Their dominant response was to run straight ahead, so they ran right into a wall, okay, and so you got this. Well, it was an easy task for the cockroach. The presence of other cockroaches made them go faster. If it was a difficult task when the dominant response was not the right one, okay, it impaired their performance. So that's a little side story, but the same holds true with people. People and cockroaches show the same relationship involving social facilitation. All right. So social facilitation has a number of theories about it. The mere presence, okay, um, and that seems to be supported because we also find it with animals. But some have also argued that the presence of others basically makes people and even animals apprehensive, okay, of being evaluated, mainly people, okay. So you get the real strong social facilitation effect when with people when they're in a situation where the others who are present are going to evaluate them. They believe they're being evaluated or judged. Okay, that's when you get the strongest kinds of social facilitation. If it's an easy task, they do it better, or a well-learned task. If it's a difficult task or not well-learned task, they do it worse. Okay, when they're facing evaluation apprehension. Okay. Um, and a third possibility, okay, is that, well, the presence of others is distracting, okay. Well, if you're distracting from something that um, from the test that you really know well, you can run automatic and you might actually even do better, okay, if you're distracted by other people, right? Okay, because, there's no, it's something you can kind of do mindlessly. You can't get any interfering thoughts and things like that. But if it's a difficult task, distraction is going to hurt. So there are various theories. The important thing for you to remember is basically the relationship, okay? Difficult task, easy task, well-learned task, facilitation, difficult task, negative facilitation, okay? and the mere presence theory seems to be sufficient to account for at least a good part of that chunk of that relationship. Okay, social loafing, when others relax us, okay? All right, so social loafing is the idea that when we're doing a group task, okay, this, so, and your contribution, okay, is pretty much, I don't want to say not, your individual output can't be identified from that of the whole group. Okay, so the specific performance of any one individual can't be determined. Okay, so when you have this kind of task, okay, um, we tend to get social loafing. So people exert less effort when working in a group than when working individually. And here's a very good example of it that actually one of my graduate mentors, Bib Latané, and some of my graduate school colleagues, Kip Williams and Steve Harkins, did many, many years ago when we were all in graduate school. And the article actually is very revealing. Many hands make light the work. I know it's hard to see this. The causes and consequences of social loafing. So what they did, and I remember the setup they had. So people are sitting in a around in a room, and they have they're given headphones, okay, that block out, in which they're getting kind of this like white noise, okay. But what they're told to do, so they can't really hear sort of what's going on around them beyond that. But what they're told to do, okay, is to upon being instructed, to either cheer, yay, or clap as loudly as they can. Okay, and basically they're doing this, and there's like 6 people there, but people are sometimes told, okay, under a certain signal, you've got to do this alone. So they think that they're clapping or cheering alone, okay, or they think that they're clapping or cheering with one other person, or actually with 3 other people, okay, or with 5 other people, so that the group size is 1, 2, 4, 6. And what the researchers are able to do, they're able to um, they're able to actually measure how much each individual is putting out in terms of clapping and cheering. Okay. Now, actually, everybody is really only cheering or clapping alone. They just think that they're clapping or cheering with others, so that the output could be measured in terms of how much output they were contributing. Okay. Um, so basically, what you find is social loafing. The more there are other people around, even though you're told, cheer or clap as loud as you can, as hard as you can. It's important, okay? And they think they are, but they're putting out less, okay? The more there are other people around. So there's social loafing going on, okay? So the output per person declined as a function of thinking that you're working either alone or in a group. Now we get social loafing. We can, and that would obviously would be a problem in certain kinds of production kinds of tasks. Okay, some of you have seen this when you've had to do group assignments leading to papers. Okay, um, well you can reduce it by having people believe that their own performances can be identified and thus evaluated. Okay, they're just not part of a pooled mix that you can't see the performance of others. Okay, the task is important and meaningful. People believe that their own efforts are necessary for a success. Your effort will determine whether we have a successful outcome. Okay, so there is this individuation, and you got to feel responsible. So social loafing is a very common thing that can occur. Um, just to give you an example of how powerful social loafing can be, okay. A great example of social loafing is the studies. Um, that's the one I'll talk about. Um, Another colleague of mine did a study back in the '80s looking at, of all things, Beatles songs. You know, the Beatles. Okay, that was a band. Okay, back in the day. So what they looked at was how the quality of the songs that were written um, by John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Okay, they used to write their own songs. Okay, of course, and they were co-authors, and no matter what they wrote, but it didn't become clear who wrote what. Okay, until about '66 or '67 with Sergeant Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour and all that. And so what they analyzed was the quality of the songs measured by Billboard ratings, rankings, and sales and things like that. And it turns out that um, the songs that they wrote, that they truly wrote together, okay, um, were not as good, okay, later, okay, when they could be individuated compared to their individually written songs, okay, um, compared to when they were before the Beatles were, before the public could identify, oh, who wrote what, and so on and so forth. And back in those days, the songs they wrote together were actually considered to be better, okay, but uh, once it became known, uh, who was writing what, then the collective songs, they kind of loafed. Okay, so they were able to find social loafing among John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Okay, group polarization. This is something that's very timely. So the exaggeration through group discussion of initial tendencies in the thinking um, of group members. Okay, well, oh, you're saying, what's this all? What's this uh, slide all about? Well, there have been just tons and tons of studies that have demonstrated group polarization. Group polarization is how group discussion of initial tendencies and the thinking of group member tends to polarize people. Okay, so some of the early studies had people basically reading about various kinds of choice dilemmas. Okay, here's a person who has this whole issue of I don't know, it might have to do it might have to do with the marital kinds of issues. Should I get married? Should I not? Should I, or business issues? Should I invest or shouldn't I? And there's pros and cons associated with it. And the the task of people reading these choice dilemmas is to indicate, so how confident would you have to be, okay, that the person would be successful, okay, in this endeavor, okay, before recommending it, kind of a risk. And in some cases, people would say, oh, I'd be kind of cautious. So they might be right over here. Um, I'd have to be like 70% sure that the person would succeed before I would recommend doing it. Okay, that's kind of a cautious thing. Got to be pretty certain before you go for this, okay? And in other cases, some of them had to do with basically were such that most people would kind of say, if you're 40% sure, if you're 30% sure, I say go for it. So that's kind of a risky decision. So we have these individual kinds of judgments. Okay? Then people are told, okay, well, we want you to get together. Why don't you discuss this a little bit with your some of these other subjects here and stuff, and then later we'll talk about it. So they discuss it, and they move further, and after they're done, they're asked, okay, so you've had a chance to discuss it. What do you think now? So people are again individually asked, what's the minimum probability of success that they would require before they give the go-ahead. And the people who are cautious, okay, after they discuss it with others, they tend to become even more cautious, okay. I don't know, if they were saying 65% certainty before I'm going to say go for it, now they're saying 80%, 85%. Don't go for it, okay. People who, if people tended to be on the risky side, they become even more risky. 40% confidence before I'm going to recommend it, now they're down to 20. Okay. And then on other dimensions, other studies have shown the same thing. If people are given an attitude scale, okay, to what extent, do you agree with, a particular policy issue? And let's say people are kind of like on the anti-side, tend to be. And then they're brought together to discuss it, and then they're separated and asked to judge it again, okay? If people were leaning anti, they become even more anti. If people are leaning pro, discussing it causes them to become more pro. One study actually, several studies were done actually by David Myers back in the 70s, the author, the senior author of your textbook. Did a study in which people read a court case, okay, a transcript of a trial, okay, and then they were asked to individually indicate the probability that the person, the defendant, was innocent or guilty, okay. And in some cases, it was set up so that most people would kind of like say, pretty moderately sure that the person was guilty, so they might be right here on the scale. You see my little, let's say right there on the scale, okay? And then they got to deliberate about it, okay? In that case, the case that was kind of, the person kind of looked slightly innocent, okay? When the jury discussed it, okay, and then the individual jurors, mock jurors, were asked to re-rate it, they became even more convinced of the person's innocence. So they moved to the pole. They moved to the extreme. In the guilt-leaning trial, where most people are here. Most of the mock jurors are here after they listen to the trial or read the trial. Once they deliberate, they become even more guilt. Their preference for guilt increases. Okay, so in all these examples and on all these kinds of scales, wherever the individuals in the group tend to be leaning, they tend to move even further out as a function of discussing it with those others. Okay, and that's group polarization. Okay, so as we've said, and here's an example from the Myers text, okay, where before discussion, okay, groups of people who are moderately prejudiced become even more prejudiced in a particular case after discussing an issue, okay. People who were low on prejudice, okay, become even less prejudiced after discussing the particular case or the particular object of prejudice. Okay, so when you think about this, you have to think in terms of this is the whole social media effect, okay, and the effect of Facebook. Who are you, who are you reading? Who's on Facebook with you? Whose opinions are you privy to? Okay, well, generally they're our friends, okay, or they're people we know through our friends or whatever, and we tend to be like-minded. We gravitate toward those who are similar, and then as we discuss and as we exchange ideas with like-minded people, we don't stay where we are. We become even more extreme, okay, in the direction we were all leaning to begin with, okay. So group polarization, and we see it in the 2016 election year, where people have polarized sort of like into two camps, right? Okay, that's a group polarization phenomenon, and which can be quite worrying, right? Okay, so there's two approaches to why that happens. One is called the persuasive arguments theory. Okay, so if you're in a group with sort of like-minded people who tend to be moderately on one side, okay, most of the arguments you're going to hear, okay, are going to be arguments that support that one side, okay. So now you've got and some of the arguments are going to be new ones to you. So if you're hearing from like-minded people new arguments, okay, the whole group tends to shift out because now they have even more arguments that support that position. So they go from moderate to extreme, all in that polarized direction, okay. And so that's one way that it happens, psychological way. And another way it happens is that what happens to us is we tend to discover if we get in with a bunch of like-minded people and we're discussing an issue, we tend to discover even more support than we originally thought there was. Okay, and the discovery sets up a new norm, a more extreme norm. Okay, that, oh wow, so the average person is sort of a bit further out than I thought they would be, even than I am. Okay, they're right. But I want to be better than average. This is what we're implicitly thinking. So we push ourselves. We socially compare our attitudes with others. We find out, we're kind of like right in. We're right with the average. So everybody wants to be better than average. So we end up moving even further out, more extreme, because of some implicit motivation to get beyond the norm, okay, in the right direction, of course, okay. By adopting a more extreme attitudinal position, members can distinguish themselves in the group in a manner approved by the group. So here I wanted to make a connection, okay? And that is a connection between um, this persuasive arguments and social comparison model, okay? These two ideas, okay, in terms of something we've now already seen, okay? And that is informational versus normative social influence. So persuasive arguments, think about it. You're hearing more information, more arguments that agree with you because you're hanging with, discussing with people who already agree with you and may have some additional ideas that you don't have. So that social influence that pushes you further out to the extreme, polarizes you, can be seen in terms of informational social influence. Okay, you're getting more information, pushing you out to the pole. Okay. The social comparison, though, we've got normative social influence. Okay, it's socially desirable. Okay, to be a little bit more extreme than the average, sort of in the right direction, the way everybody's feeling, but a little bit more so. Okay, and we do that because it improves our odds of social acceptance. It improves our odds of really being on the in terms of this belongingness need. Okay, so here we've got we can see a connection between the two theories of why polarization occurs and these two forms of social influence. Okay, and the final thing here, and that if you look really closely, is supposed to be de-individuation. And I'm so sorry that this slide turned out to have that so hard to see. So it says de-individuation. It's in the textbook. De-individuation involves the loss of self-awareness and self-restraint. Okay, riots, concerts where people, we cheer, we swear, we smoke pot, we do all kinds of things that we wouldn't do, um, um, you know, individually in a public situation, in sort of a public situation. We lose our self-constraint, we lose our self-awareness, and that's called de-individuation. Online bullying is another example as described in the textbook. Whoops. Oy. Well, I guess I don't have more slides that talk about this, but the fact is that people tend to do more extreme things, and I want to make sure you read about this in groups when they have a sense of anonymity, okay, relative to situations where they can be identified. People can be identified. You probably know this intuitively. Your textbook talks about some of the examples of this and some of the ideas behind why that happens. Groupthink, I won't spend a lot of time on groupthink. So groupthink basically is a phenomenon that groups can sometimes make dumb decisions and not work as well as individuals might thinking about the same problem. Okay, because sometimes because of normative influence pressures, in particular, conformity pressures, belongingness pressures, and things like that, that under certain circumstances people are constrained and they won't express opposition to the way the group is going. Okay, and that's the phenomenon of groupthink. Okay, and here are some symptoms of groupthink. So sometimes groups brought together to make like important business decisions and so on will have sort of an illusion that maybe a God complex thing, if you will, to put it in a vernacular, that hey, you know what, we got all the experts here. We're invulnerable. Our decision will be right. These guys know what they're doing. You might have you believe that the group is moral. You make collective rationalizations. Okay, you apply stereotypes about groups. Okay, and most important, okay, is these last three: self-censorship, illusion of unanimity, direct pressure on dissenters. Okay, so what happens is that people, if they're in a situation where these kinds of symptoms persist, okay, censor themselves as a way of avoiding social disapproval, rejection, uh, and so they don't speak up. Okay, other people don't speak up because they have the illusion that everyone's in agreement because no one's objecting because of self-censorship and so on, and this illusion of invulnerability and all that. So we get the illusion of unanimity. Okay, um, we put direct, and then in other cases you end up with people putting direct pressure on dissenters. Okay, so when you observe that when someone does step out of line and disagree, they get all kinds of grief. Okay, and they get pressure to join the fold. Okay, Irving Janis, Janis, did some classic case studies. Okay, in which he effectively discovered and began the understanding of groupthink, um, studying some famous fiascos that occurred. So, for example, the Bay of Pigs fiasco in the early 60s when the Kennedy administration and his cabinet and his group of inside advisors, okay, basically came to the conclusion that they should go in and, with this covert operation, um, invade Cuba through this Bay of Pigs uh, entry. Okay, it turned out to be a complete fiasco, and it was so badly thought out that it was like a major disaster of that presidency. Okay, and Janice studied this and found that, basically what was going on is that everybody got caught into this mindset. Okay, you had some polarization going on. You had all these, and there was no check on it. Okay, there was no one saying, playing devil's advocate, outside people being brought in to hear what was going on. What the thinking was, that it was all on this insular group that made the decision. Kennedy, okay, actually learned from this experience, and in the next crisis he faced, which was the Cuban Missile Crisis, made the right decision with the same people, okay, because he assigned his brother, and at that time the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, as kind of like, he said, you've got to be the outside observer. You're on the inside, but I want you to play devil's advocate and keenly watch what's going on, okay, and play devil's advocate and and make sure that other people are also speaking up. So he became the outside kind of observer who would basically try to pull people out of these. Um, this self-censorship and so on and so forth. It was openly stated that I want to hear all sides, and no one is to basically comment either way about all sides, any of the sides, until we get them all out there. And the Cuban Missile Crisis turned out to be a successful uh, outcome because uh, the group avoided groupthink. So I'll put this up and let you think about it. Okay. Do groups make better decisions? Okay. Well, polarization and groupthink suggest not so much. Okay. Uh, but we've seen how groupthink can be avoided under certain circumstances. And if you're mindful about polarization, you can avoid that as well. And it helps. So groups don't necessarily make better decisions. Sometimes they make worse decisions, but you can overcome it. Like, for example, polarization. If you're making like an important decision, you want to get some people in there who are on the other side. Okay. You want a diverse group. Okay. You don't want like-minded people because they're going to move out and convince themselves out to the extreme. With groupthink, you want people, you want devil's advocates, and you want group leaders who are non-directive, who are not authority figures, remember obedience, okay, who basically direct the show and about with in whose presence people are reluctant to speak out, and so they self-censor. So groups are a mixed bag from a social psychological perspective, and that's that. Okay. So we'll continue. Well, we're done with the social influence part. The next part is to talk about prejudice and aggression, and that's forthcoming in the future.